Well, good afternoon. This is on, right? Is it on? Yeah. So, welcome to the Alumnus of the Year lecture. On the off chance that you follow professional basketball, you will know that this has been a halcyon year for individual performance in the sport. For only the second time in its history, a player completed the season averaging a triple-double. Now, a triple-double, as again some of you will know, means that a player, in this case Russell Westbrook of the Oklahoma City Thunder, was able, over the course of an 82-game season, to score more than 10 points, snag more than 10 rebounds, and pass out more than 10 assists per game. Now, the magnitude of this achievement is best captured by the fact that a player who achieves a triple-double in a game is celebrated as having performed a feat of significance. Many of the very best basketball players never actually do this in a game. Achieving it requires a player to combine what are usually pretty disparate skills, along with a special appetite for tenacity about the game. The usually taciturn Oscar Robertson, Westbrook's predecessor in performing this feat of averaging a triple-double over a season, was so thrilled by Westbrook's achievement that he remarked immediately on its difficulty, and then said that it meant that Westbrook was without question this year's NBA most valuable player. Now, in the academic world, there is a version of the triple-double, enumerated as teaching, research, and service. Here, too, disparate skills are required. Here, too, a certain tenacity of application is important. Like most good basketball teams, most alumni cohorts of a school are comprised of people who do at least one and sometimes two of these especially well. Those who do three are perhaps not so rare as in the NBA, but they are unusual and they merit celebration. That is what we are about here today. We are celebrating someone who has performed a triple-double throughout his career. John Corrigan is a 1982 graduate of the Divinity School, where he received his PhD with distinction, with a concentration in the history of Christianity under the advisorship of Gerald C. Brown. Professor Corrigan is a Lucius Moody Bristol Distinguished Professor of Religion, Professor of History, and Distinguished Research Professor at Florida State University. That makes him a Seminole, which I'm still getting my head around. Other faculty appointments regularly visiting include the University of Virginia, Harvard University, Columbia University, Oxford University, University of London, Arizona State University, University of Halle-Wittenberg, University College of Dublin. He's also held appointment as a visiting scholar at the American Academy in Rome, of which I am very jealous, and as the Fulbright Distinguished Research Chair for the Netherlands. His scholarship is best indexed by the fact that he is the author or editor of 29 books on topics in American religious history, religion and emotion, religious intolerance, and religion and space. Among the most significant publications of this large group include monographs such as The Hidden Balance, The Prism of Piety, and Business of the Heart, Religion and Emotion in the 19th Century. But Professor Corrigan also has published, notably, in a very collaborative way with other scholars. And in doing that, as well as in his single-authored monograph, is constantly aiming at redefining at once the field of American religious history and the way in which we study religion. In such works, for example, as multiple editions of Religion in America, of which he is the co-author. There are at least 5 imprints in a Korean translation. In Jews, Christians, Muslims, of which he is co-author, 3 imprints. Emotion and Religion, of which he is co-author. And then Approaches and Interpretations to Religion and Emotion, French and Spanish Missions in North America, and the Oxford Handbook of Religion and Emotion, of which he is an editor. Again and again, he is working with other scholars to rethink the way we organize the field and its data. Not one to rest on those laurels, Professor Corrigan has forthcoming books in each of these genres, including the Oxford Encyclopedia of American Religion, of which he is editor-in-chief, a book called Feeling Religion, which I'm quite intrigued about, The Business Term in American Religious History, which he's editing with Amanda Porterfield and Darren Graham, and Religious Spaces in the Atlantic World. We're lucky to get him here today, given how busy he is. And last but not least, Return to Sender, American Protestant Missionaries in Europe. He served as co-editor of Church History, Studies in Christianity and Culture for 13 years, from 2003 to 2016, and as I noted, is editor-in-chief of the Oxford Encyclopedia of American Religion, and editor of the University of Chicago's History of American Religion series, which he's doing with Alan Thomas, who I saw coming here a little earlier, as well. He's also done work on the spatial humanities and is interested in the idea of deep mapping of religion. Professor Corrigan at Florida State University is striking to those of us in the academy who follows education and religion for having successfully developed a flourishing program on that study in a state university in a system that is not notable for its friendliness to the humanities. He spoke today to the Craft of Teaching workshop on teaching first-year students religion in the college, and said something about having 8,000 to 9,000 students a year come through the department, which elicited gasps from everyone in the audience. And then followed it up by saying, yes, numbers really talk at state schools. So I don't know who's going to talk about that today, but that's an interesting thing. But he's someone who, in addition to being a superb teacher, as we could see at lunchtime, has literally built that department at both the undergraduate and graduate levels through his leadership. So I'm delighted to introduce to you someone who it seems to me is clearly the Russell Westbrook for the Academy of Religion in 2017. And he's at least our alumnus of the year, John Corrigan, who will speak on religion, emotion, and history. Welcome.
Thank you. It's just a thrill to be compared to Russell Westbrook. I might take a few days to just enjoy that sort of comparison. I want to thank the Divinity School Alumni Council and the Board of Trustees for this honor. And I thank Rick Rosengarten and Aaron Hollander and Andrew Sieber as well for arranging my visit and for making me feel so at home here. I'm also grateful to those colleagues who nominated me for Alumnus of the Year. It's a pleasure to be recognized by one's peers, and especially so for this honor. I also want to acknowledge this place, the Divinity School. Whatever traces of the late 1970s and early 1980s are coded in these walls, I hazard that they are good spirits, as it were, and especially so the muse of interdisciplinarity, who sang to me when I was here, and who has remained in my ear in the decades since. Traversing disciplinary boundaries seemed to be an everyday enterprise here, and for many of us it became such a habit that after a while we did not even notice it. If there really is such a thing as a habitus, the air we breathe, that's what it was. In any event, I have ended up as a scholar who happily poaches from the territories of colleagues working in a wide range of fields. And my academic conversational partners are from many places. My regular faculty appointments have been in departments of religious studies, history, and American studies. And my visiting appointments have been in social sciences in a research center, a school for politics and economics, a lit crit operation, a divinity school, a transnational studies center, and upcoming a university institute on culture and media. This is all a way of prefacing my comments this afternoon, which draw upon several areas of scholarship, hopefully in a productive way. But as a point of departure, hats off to the University of Chicago Divinity School for modeling the way forward. So enough about me, let's talk about you. All of you here in this room who have bodies and brains and nerves and whose limbic and endocrine systems are dripping special juices into your bloodstream and routing electrical impulses that influence how you breathe and sweat and how you move your facial muscles and bodies into postures that express anger or surprise or embarrassment or other affects. You are feeling creatures. Let's talk about that a little and about what that has to do with history and culture. For decades, the starting points for many scholars in talking about emotion have been Darwin's The Expression of Emotion in Man and Animals, and William James's Principles of Psychology. I want to set off today on the other foot by referencing the work of the historian Richard Hofstadter. In 1964, Hofstadter, who was by then a multi-Pulitzer winner and arguably the young dean of American historians, published a highly influential and enduring interpretation of American political culture, the paranoid style in American politics. I say enduring not just because only a few years ago, over a half century after its publication, the columnist George Will pulled it off his bookshelf to lash out at it as a model of liberal error, but because American historians over the years consistently have found it suggestive for its characterization of American anxieties about conspiracy and related fear of the deep state in all of its various forms. But more to the point for us today, Hofstadter's study, later expanded, was, he said, essentially about the feeling of persecution. In his introduction to the subject, he was clear about his approach. My intention here, however, is not to make comparative judgments, but simply to establish the reality of the style and to illustrate its frequent historical recurrence. Expanding on that, he asserted the recurrence of the paranoid style over a long span of time and in different places suggests that a mentality disposed to see the world in the paranoid's way may always be present. Hofstadter accordingly began with the view of the late 18th century and recorded recurring instances in which the paranoid style played a key role in the politics of the nation. He reached into the distant past, drawing upon Norman Cohn's rich study of early modern religious movements, the pursuit of the millennium, to illustrate the deep roots of what he called a mentality. And he noted accordingly that the paranoid style was not limited to America. It could be found in other places, in Europe and beyond. But the task, he said, was to demonstrate its presence in American politics. What is important about this essay, beyond the fact that it forays the history of emotions, is the approach it takes to history. The key word here is recurrence. Hofstadter claimed that a certain feeling of persecution, but more broadly paranoia, recurred in American political history from the late 18th century to the mid-20th century when he was writing. Paranoia for Hofstadter was visible in all kinds of political and social settings over many decades of American history. Over time, it appeared in different ways, but it did not appreciably change. Paranoia for Hofstadter was the feeling of paranoia. The historian's work, as much as it can be identified in that essay, was less to explain how the feeling of paranoia changed along with social and cultural shifts. Rather, and this is my expression, not Hofstadter's, the assignment was to make an historical inventory of its occurrences. For Hofstadter, such an approach, which to some extent put on hold analysis of cause and effect, did not violate the bylaws of the historian's craft. An historical inventorying of emotions was a plausible history. Things have changed since 1964. The history of emotions, pioneered more recently by Peter Stearns and others, places greater emphasis on change over time in emotional life, and that approach is a productive one as well, one that I personally find useful in much of my own writing. But I want to pay more attention to the study of emotions as a making of historical inventories right now. And I think that approach especially can be worthwhile when we study religion. When I think of inventory, I think first of all of things on a supermarket shelf. That picture might have something to do with my work experience as a teenager, or equally my hopelessly advanced assimilation into the Borg of commerce. But for whatever reasons, that image occupies me for a split second before I get to where I think I want to go, which, if the stars are aligned, is to a more complex understanding of inventory. If all of us were to imagine an inventory of things on a shelf, we probably would agree It is an image of stacked objects that remain exactly as they are until someone takes them off the shelf and uses them. Things ready and waiting to be used by us. I think there is some of that in Hofstadter's history of the paranoid style. The feeling of paranoia in his study is a constant, a feeling that can be identified in a wide range of historical and social settings. It is not quite as simple as, here's an occasion for paranoia, look, there it is, take it off the shelf and have at it. But there is a way of thinking about paranoia, or any emotion, that relies on a conceptualization of the feeling as a thing. I do not mean thing exactly in the sense that it is used by feminist new materialism theorists, such as Karen Barad or Jane Bennett, whose post-humanist materiality advocates for the ontological oneness of things, such as rocks, piles of trash, bars of metal, old railroad cars, electrons, and the human body, a walking, talking mineral, all joined as actants in a seemingly non-anthropocentric network. Rather, I'm talking about emotion as a thing in the sense of a fact of human behavior that cannot be historicized away, or otherwise explained entirely as a byproduct of social and cultural circumstances. The current academic interest in affect has something in common with this way of thinking about emotional inventory. Some researchers see affect as cross-cultural and trans-historical, a biologically grounded and neurologically driven physical response to environmental stimuli. Affect theory, simply put, is about what the psychologist Sylvan Tompkins and his disciples, not surprisingly, call affects. Notable followers include Paul Ekman, who developed facial expression training, nowadays an edge sought by police and corporate human resource officers looking for frauds and fakers. The theory asserts that there are 9 affects: joy, excitement, surprise, anger, disgust, anguish, fear, shame, and dismell, which means a kind of impulse to avoid. They are said to be hardwired in all of us. Affect theory attempts, first of all, to impulsive physical expression. Affect theorists see in the smile the sign of an affective fact, the affect of joy, typically. That joy displayed on the face is not something that persons have to talk themselves into. It is a physically embodied emotion. It does not require the discourses of culture, however those are defined, in order to take place. As religion and emotions researcher Donovan Schaefer writes, affect theory seeks to discover in affect something of the pre-discursive materiality of bodies. Or, in the words of affect theorist Brian Masumi, it is an approach that acknowledges that the skin is faster than the word. The idea of discrete, facially coded emotions has been severely criticized recently by neuroscientist Lisa Feldman-Barrett for its adoption of folk categories of emotional states, but the point remains, feeling has a pre-discursive bodily component. Part of the reason that affect theory has been claiming the attention of persons working in humanities, including religion, is, I think, its compatibility with an inventorying of emotion, such as that modeled by Hofstadter, and adapted in decades since by a number of other historically inclined scholars. But affect theory, additionally, is a potential collaborator with phenomenological approaches that religion researchers especially often have found effective in building interpretations. In suggesting some connections between affect theory, historical inventory, phenomenology, and religion, then, I will start with the word in the other direction about emotion as a construction. There are many ways to study religion and emotion, too many to survey in a lecture. And there are too many good themes in studies of religion and emotion to directly address now. But if one wanted quickly to survey the field, one place to stand from which to do so would be the ground occupied by the constructivist approach. Typically, for religion researchers, that means threading together scholarship from anthropology, sociology, history, and psychology. A constructivist approach foregrounds the social and cultural settings of emotion. A shorthand way of understanding this, at least understanding some of the roots of it, is to invoke the anthropology of Clifford Geertz. Once Geertz began to press the case for a culturally constructed self in the 1970s, scholars recognized its possibilities for the study of emotions. Michel Rosaldo and Catherine Lutz, among others, argued that emotion as an integral aspect of self was constructed within local, social, and cultural frameworks. Lutz, for example, wrote about how emotions among Micronesian islanders differed from what Westerners had considered natural emotions. Her unexpected finding of multiple feelings clustered in a single emotion, the absence of certain feelings, or the striking centrality of others, the complex ways in which emotions were gendered, and the ways in which they served social purposes all pointed for Lutz to the cultural construction of emotion. Lutz's evocative book title, Unnatural Emotions, pointedly expressed the refusal to treat emotions as a given in nature. And it challenged the idea that an emotion was an irreducible datum, a conclusion that would test religion scholars who sometimes freely associated emotion with religion itself in a way that essentialized both. Similarly, for social psychologist James Averill and sociologist Arlie Hochschild, the social function of emotions were paramount. Hochschild, in a study of the emotional lives of flight attendants and bill collectors, coined the term feeling rules to identify how feelings were elicited and regulated by prompts and standards that were coded in culture. Such rules, as Averill argued, were part of our second nature. There was a kind of historical constructivism as well. Several decades ago, Peter and Carol Stearns coined the term emotionology to refer to the historically constructed expectations for feeling, expressing, and concealing emotions. While anthropologists made specific cultural context the frame for feeling rules, the Stearns proposed that a particular historical setting constructed a feeling in a similar way. So, for example, in his history of jealousy in America, Peter Stearns discussed the way in which romantic jealousies and sibling jealousies, among others, were historically defined and constructed, which means, among other things, that they changed over time. Just as we might note that in ancient Greece, some expressions of anger could be prized as blessed rage bordering on divinity, and that in the 21st century, American road rage will get you arrested. Jealousy in American history was conceptualized and experienced differently depending on the historical circumstances. So, for example, over the course of time, as the gravity of communities faded, as their capability to hold persons in line with structural controls declined, and the notion of romantic love ascended as the context for courtship, jealousy became more profound and more frequent. In Stearns' view, adults who were becoming less practiced in sublimating self-interest to an ideal of community, and at the same time were more pointedly prompted to claim a right to courtship based on a concept of romantic love, were more liable to feel jealous and to express their jealousy when the prospective pairing did not work out in the way that they had hoped. In short, the historically constructed expectations and guidelines for jealousy, the emotionology for jealousy, changed, and the emotional lives of men and women changed with it. Constructivist approaches, with their dislike of essentialist theories of emotion, that is, the kinds of theories that many in the study of religion have long favored, strongly influenced historical scholarship in the decades following this groundbreaking research. Historians of religion, who for other reasons already had begun to turn away from reliance on understandings of emotions as generalizable, transhistorical, and cross-cultural things, turning away, for example, from Schleiermacher's freestanding feeling of absolute dependence, began to write emotion into narratives about religion that stressed historical and cultural reasons why people felt the way they did and why they practiced emotion in ways that were context dependent. Experimenting with the claim that feelings were learned, not given, historians studying religion tried new ways of exploring how emotions were related to institutions, doctrines, rituals, and material culture. Such projects, on the whole, were not undertaken to smoke out evidence for grand claims about emotions as constructed experiences, but rather they were efforts to integrate emotional life more substantially into religious history. Much of this work in the end has been on the regulation of emotions, their elicitation as well as their suppression in religious settings. And much of it has been on what medievalist Barbara Rosenwein has called emotional communities. The emotional experiences of groups as it might be expressed in terms such as emotional tenor or mood or simply collective emotion. Historians, of course, wish to tell stories about the religious past that demonstrate how things have changed, including emotion. That endeavor typically has involved a certain amount of historical reduction of emotional experience to components that signal responses to shifting social and cultural forces. But at the same time, historians have struggled, sometimes with some success, and sometimes less so, to avoid trampling on subjectivities, to avoid radically constructivist, radically historicized interpretations. We can glimpse that struggle in Susan Carrot-Nunn's The Reformation of Feeling, Shaping the Religious Emotions in Early Modern Germany. Her study details the manner in which Protestant, Reformed, and Lutheran emotional tenors were created or reinforced in the 16th century. Carrot-Nunn demonstrates, for example, how sermonic literature and material culture signaled to Lutheran churchgoers that late medieval emotion-oriented piety was at an end. Her words. That piety was recast as a concentrated emphasis on masculinized and more intellectualized demonstrations of faith that modeled composure and control over against the presumed recklessness of female emotionality. Pulpit messages were one way in which that shift was fostered, but so was the redecoration of Lutheran churches. The depictions of the agonized body in the image of the crucifixion or in the torture of martyrs, which, according to Carrot-Nunn, aroused the emotions of fear and terror among late medieval Christians, became less common in Lutheran churches in favor of art depicting outward tranquility as a marker of deep and careful reflection about sin, atonement, and salvation. Carrot-Nunn suggests that the calm gaze of Jesus in the Wittenberg altarpiece represented that shift. Women, as emblems of loss of emotional control, all but disappeared from holy art in Lutheran churches as those churches were readorned. Emotion for Lutherans did not disappear, but it was remade in ways that fitted developing Lutheran theological interests and that represented the distancing of Lutheranism from some characteristic features of Catholic piety, as well as from popular religion that was manifest in art and stories and legends. Carrot-Nunn accordingly attempts to walk the line between indicating the degree to which early modern emotionality was deconstructed and reconstructed by historical events, while at the same time holding out for emotion itself as something enduring and in many terms, in many ways, I suppose, thing-like. Gender as a social context is especially inviting for histories of religion and emotion. Phyllis Mack's study of men and women in early Methodism, heart religion in the British Enlightenment, gender and emotion in early Methodism, like Carrot-Nunn's research, also addresses the gendering of emotion. But her religious community is more recognizable as a community of writers who live their daily lives sometimes together and sometimes apart. Mack's approach, consequently, is oriented toward understanding writers such as Mary Fletcher and James Rogers against the background of Puritan, pietist, and Enlightenment discourses about emotion. She moves between that larger canvas and the shared agenda of the small-scale early Methodist community, describing how Methodists together conceptualized emotion as both a potential threat requiring disciplining and an energy that powered missionary undertakings and enhanced persons' agency as spiritual seekers. Everyday life, which includes writing, is central to her analysis, and her examination of social relations among Methodists shows them to be crucial to Methodists imagining their spiritual lives. As Mack proposes, her words, while women and men have the same capacity for the experience and expression of feelings, their different patterns of friendship and marriage generated a different emotional and imaginative relationship to the divine. Again, here's an effort to talk about a shared, non-gendered human capacity to feel alongside interpretation that argues for disjuncture in the feeling lives of men and women as a consequence of historical forces that shape marriage, friendship, and some other behaviors. My own study of religion and emotion in the mid-19th century, Business of the Heart, published in 2001, likewise attended to gender and to race and ethnicity as well, in arguing for the emergence of a broad cultural rethinking in churches as well as outside of them of the nature of emotion itself. I argued that Protestant Christians reconceptualized emotion. I argued that Protestant Christians reconceptualized emotion as a commodity that could be traded to God for favors. In my view, they endeavored to imagine emotion itself as a thing, as something akin to a material gift that they could give to God. And in fact, they habitually utilized the materially inflected phrase, give my heart to God, to represent their sense of emotion and indeed themselves. My sense was that these historical actors' conceptualization of emotion and religion was part of a broader way of thinking about emotion that involved a great many wheels turning together. Commerce, boy culture, marriage and courtship, physical education, teacher-student relationships, the rise of the theater, changing gender norms, and much else. Emotion in religion, moreover, was performed, and I'll return to that, in ways similar to how courtship was practiced, or children trained, or games of boys went rat hunting, or how any of the other happy, sad, fearful, or wondrous events were emotionally performed in America in the 19th century. There were the formulaic voicings of emotional expectations, the standardized physical expression of feelings, the habitual act of writing emotion in a diary, the scripted reactions of awe and wonder at the spectacle of buildings on fire, the ritual of mourning, all performances of the emotions felt on such occasions. There was nothing special about emotion in relation to religion, and it was subject to the same historical forces as any other aspect of 19th century urban American culture. In that sense, emotion in religion was as emotion in any other context. But after all was said and done, emotion remained a thing. That is, people physically felt what they all agreed was joy or fear or anger. In other words, after acknowledging the power of culture and history to change emotionality, we glimpsed that there was still the phenomenon of emotion. The phenomenon of emotion, a simple phrase, but brimming with theoretical aspirations. It is a topic now ascending in philosophy and shows signs of making inroads in religious studies. I might add that we who are discussing this topic in this UC Divinity School lecture room today are a full 4 days ahead of our colleagues at the University of Liège, who will convene on Monday a major conference on the topic, the Phenomenology of Emotions. Here is how that conference frames the issue. To date, the nature of emotions still remains a thorny issue. Part of the problem is that the term emotion covers a wide range of phenomena. It is indeed commonly used to refer to phenomena as different, as joy, sadness, fear, anger, astonishment, boredom, love, aversion, jealousy, and so forth. This raises the following classical questions. Does the term emotion refer to a natural kind? Do all emotions exhibit a common feature? Of late, my way of approaching these questions as a cultural historian has been to draw upon phenomenological theory that is indebted to Merleau-Ponty, among others, for its focus on embodiments. I got pointed in this direction partly because I reevaluated Merleau-Ponty, but equally so because I set out to learn something about the neuroscience of emotion. It turns out that while people like some of us in this room were poring over phenomenology of perception or Husserl's logical investigations, other people like Lisa Barrett and James Russell actually were at work in labs connecting the dots about how the body was involved in feeling fear, anger, surprise, and other emotions. The study of brain circuitry and hormones, the conductivity of nerves, the glands that make little drops of neurochemicals, the cingulate cortex, the hypothalamus, and much else advanced rapidly in the late 20th century and the early 21st centuries, as did genomic research. Some scientists, in course, proposed very specific understandings of emotional experience. For example, Swedish medical researcher Hugo Lofheim, who was influenced by Sylvan Tompkins' affect theory, presented a case several years ago that each of the 8 affects that Tompkins and his disciples identified could be defined by the relative levels of serotonin, dopamine, and noradrenaline in the blood. Surprise, for example, correlated with high serotonin, low dopamine, and high noradrenaline, while shame registered low on all 3 substances. Other researchers located emotions in specific parts of the brain. One study associated anger with the left prefrontal cortex. Another located disgust in the right prefrontal. Whether it is relatively well-known research such as that on seasonal affective disorder and light therapy treatment, or highly specialized work on emotions and the homeostatic body, or Barrett's more holistic theory of emotions, theory points in the same direction. Inasmuch as bodies are alike, they will feel similar emotions. Emotions are a thing, a bodily thing, a physically identifiable characteristic of the sensing body as it moves through its various multi-layered environments where physical, geographic, cultural, historical, institutional, and discursive frames influence the ways in which bodies, ideas, power, language, and much else constitute assemblages or dynamic networks of relationships. We are talking, obviously, about materiality that cannot be historicized away. And at the same time, we're talking about getting past binaries such as thinking mind, feeling body, nature, culture, and hopefully historicizing subject, historical object. Which brings us, of course, to Shakespeare and sex. I admire more than ever Ruth Smith's influential article, Pre-Modern Sexualities, published 17 years ago. In that article, Smith argued that it is hard to name eros, even though I just seem to have done it. And for that reason, for Smith, it resists objectification. It can be corralled in a certain way by calling it sexualitas, and in that way made an object of scientific investigation. But, said Smith, for the historical subjects who felt it, no less than for the critic who reads its textual record, eros remains a subjective experience. Then, drawing on Jean-François Lyotard, he proposed that such objects of historical inquiry are never really objects at all if we identify the historian as sharing a continuum of time with what they research. In short, his words, the past is both now and no longer, as the future is both now and not yet. If the central insight of phenomenology is that you cannot know anything apart from the way in which you come to know it, then what Smith called a historical phenomenology proceeds, in the case of eros, or for us, any theory, by recognizing the embodiedness of historical subjects as it examines the material traces of their lives, and at the same time that it admits the embodiedness of the historian who undertakes that. Taking Smith seriously, we nevertheless must recognize that different cultural and historical frameworks of feeling, in some sort of way, the emotionologies that the Stearns wrote about, means that feeling fear or sadness or distress in one context is not exactly the same as another. When we think of emotions, first of all, as embodied, the historical study of emotions is included within a broader history of sensing. Portia's embarrassment in The Merchant of Venice is recognizable to us. But it is likely that Shakespeare felt embarrassment differently than we do, just as we likely smell burning coal differently than he did. The discursive context for smelling and feeling matter. Nevertheless, smelling coal and feeling embarrassment as subjective, embodied processes resist objectification. Historical phenomenology treats sensing and feeling as parts of a broad ecology, as components in an assemblage or deep network, to reiterate two terms current in humanities vocabulary. When Shakespeare scholars Kevin Kern and James Kearney talk about how such an approach abandons the distinctions between persons and things, emphasizing how meaning accrues from the way sensing bodies experience and perceive objects, they're endeavoring to identify an historical approach that resists binaries, and particularly an approach that advocates the critical but phenomenologically sympathetic engagement of the emotional dimensions of early modern culture. A detailed discussion of the history and phenomenology that directly address some of these issues is in philosopher David Carr's recent Experience and History. For 40 years, Carr has been making a case for a view of historical method that differs from those that privilege representation and memory. In other words, he found the linguistic turn, with its emphasis on linguistic representation and narrative, a view that was expounded in Missouri Building by Hayden White in the 1970s, to be lacking, just as he did the notion of collective memory that is associated with the work of Maurice Halbwachs. Both, he said, begin with the gap between us and the past. He instead has proposed a phenomenological approach to history that, in his words, puts experience in their place, that is, in place of representation and memory. Part of that new approach is to take narrative as an essential feature of human existence, rather than as an alien structure that is imposed on the past and as such distorts it. In this he agrees in some ways with Paul Ricoeur, a former Divinity School faculty member, who at that same meeting here in the 1970s at which Hayden White spoke, also spoke for a very different idea about narrative as something that is fundamentally human. The upshot is this. For Carr, the human experience of narrative connects us to the experiences of the past, but we are connected as well because experience itself is temporally extended and cumulative. We might understand this as another way of saying that the past is both now and no longer, as the future is both now and not yet. If Carr is right, that there is a bridge of experience that can inform historical investigation, if historical phenomenology enables a way to grasp, especially, something of the feeling life of the past, we must recognize that performances of feeling, nevertheless, are shaped by history and culture. We smell burning coal differently than Shakespeare because the historical circumstances that frame that experience are different. The same is true for our feeling sad or embarrassed. We might be able to agree that there are certain affects, such as anguish, shame, or excitement, all possibly correlated with similar specific biochemical and neuroemotional events taking place in our bodies that are similar across time and culture. Nonetheless, shifting cultural, institutional, and discursive frameworks will influence performance. If Merleau-Ponty's notion of a reduction as an attempt to describe the experience from within is a guide here, so also is his dictum that the most important lesson which the reduction teaches us is the impossibility of a complete reduction. Some leads on working within this complex framework of analysis are available in scholarship in the rapidly transforming field of performance studies. In recent years, scholars such as Stuart Grant have been rebelling against what they characterize as the oppressive reign of discursive and political approaches to the understanding of performance. Instead, they advocate a phenomenological approach that, according to Grant, offers relief from the over-determining theoretical violence of such modes of inquiry by getting back to the things themselves. That means, in short, the body, its movements, its sounds, and so forth, not so much as intention toward, but as participation with. Such an approach attempts to define performance as physical performance of the body that occurs in concert with other things. A sensing body is something like a node in a network, an item in an assemblage, a partner in multifarious relationships. That scheme of linkages or assemblage is not easy to see and difficult to theorize, but as a conceptualization of the feeling body in a social world of languages and politics, it might be a productive prompt to research on religion and emotion. The historians of emotions William Reddy and Monique Scher have adopted some of this thinking specifically to understandings of emotion as practice. For them, the role of the body is crucial to emotionality, but it is not a static, timeless, universal foundation that produces ahistorical emotional arousal. It's socially situated, trained, plastic, and thus historical. For them, emotional life is a habit of performance, set within that understanding of body and culture. More daringly, Sarah Ahmed, together with some other affect theorists, have placed the sensing body prominently within what they call an affect economy, locating power in the circulation of affect, and suggesting that power is best understood less as a platform of systematically articulated ideas than as a tornado of feelings. As such, emotion becomes a materialist rhetoric. I like the term offered by the philosopher Luca Barlassina for talking about this kind of approach. He calls it impure somatic theory. To conclude then, with a return to historical inventories, why would we want to make a historical inventory of a feeling or clusters of feelings? And how does that help us research religion? I do not think that we should be any less rigorous or ambitious in our historicizing emotion. The more we are able to join emotions to historical frameworks, the more we are able to chart the ways in which various emotions are shaped by culture, and the better position we are in to understand the history of religion as a dynamic history of feeling, and as a matter of ideas and institutions as well. Emotional life changes, religion changes, institutions change, but thinking about emotion as human experience involving the body and the chemical and neural structures of the body especially makes possible a kind of historical phenomenology that stands a chance of getting us closer to understanding not just the ideas and institutions, but the experiences of religious persons as they practice them in their own ways through their everyday lives. Just as importantly, that kind of qualified phenomenological approach makes possible the study of religion and emotion in connection with the long record of the intertwined histories of emotion and religion. Religion has provided much of the vocabulary for thinking about emotion in Western history. When we talk about emotion today, we still draw upon deeply embedded ideas about self and body, mind and transcendence, intention and inaction that were relevant in emotional writings by a long string of figures, from Augustine to Aquinas, Marjorie Kemp to Spinoza. There is an exceptionally rich and deep religious literature about emotion that we would be wise to continue to mine, in spite of the differences with much of what we know today about the body and feeling. I'm not proposing that we look for the keys to understanding feeling in medieval treatises, but we should look to medieval treatises to inform us about what people felt as part of the historical study of religion and emotion. And we bear in mind that over the last couple of hundred years, some of the most interesting and sometimes influential theorizing about religion and emotion has been by writers who stress individual, complex emotions such as the feeling of absolute dependence or Otto's Mysterium Tremendum. Those feelings are very much worth exploring today, in spite of the fact that they've been fully clothed in a Christian apologetic since they were first proposed. They should be inventoried, which means taken seriously as phenomena grounded in bodily sensation and at the same time shaped by culture. A truly attentive, serious inventorying of emotions and religion will study them alongside of the short list of experiences currently of interest to affect researchers. The point will be to understand the range of feeling, the variety of emotions involved in religion, to learn more about how religion as ideas, rituals, and social groupings is related to feelings, and to experiment with bridging the gap, as David Carr might say, between us and the religious lives of the historical figures and groups that we study. This does not mean that we cannot consider how emotions are historically constructed. That would be a mistake. But it does mean that we can think of emotions as something shared even across time. The aim of a robust history of emotions in religion would not be to prove a theory of what emotion is. Rather, it would draw upon a wide range of scholarship in multiple disciplines to provide a fuller understanding of an area of human experience crucial to appreciating the complexity of religion, its historical changes, and its relation to other aspects of culture.
Floor is open for questions.
Does anyone feel their heart strangely warmed?
As you were talking particularly towards the end, the distinction of emotion as a interactive category with the intellectual and the institutional elements in religion, I couldn't help but thinking of Dark Hugo and his mystical element of religion, Cantonese, which he identifies as three fundamental areas of religion and necessity for their interaction. Much of what you're saying about emotion is what Hugo would have put under this mentioned, except for expanding it, obviously, with a whole range of discussion with other. Have you thought about that? Or
Yeah.
too little in the background?
That's a very good example. Some of what I'm proposing is very similar to him. What I'm trying to do, though, is to remove as much of the baggage of his proposal as I can, particularly by taking on that idea of emotion as being kind of irreducible datum, only mystically in some sort of way apprehended. So I'm very much in sympathy with the way he writes about it, and very much in sympathy with the way I think he talks about really even an embodied kind of feeling. But I want to move it away from a kind of discourse that makes it hard for us to connect it to a more scientifically inflected language that we use now. But that's very much the sort of thing I had in mind. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you very much for the lecture. I was especially intrigued by the sort of shift from the history from representation to experience. And I was wondering if you could expound a little more on the role of temporality, because that came up periodically in your lecture, but not in a thematic cluster.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that there would be a different appreciation of temporality, whether you're thinking about representation or experience.
Yeah, you're figuring out a very difficult part of it. I think David Carr's made a good shot at trying to explain some of that, but it always seems to come up a little bit short. And the problem is always one of trying to explain how a common denominator of unchanged in biochemical processes, if we want to claim that over the course of, say, 300 or 400 years, can be reconciled with an argument for the changing nature of political cultural power frameworks, whatever, that are always going to have some effect upon at least the language we use to talk about emotion. So part of the trick then in solving or attempting to solve the problem of temporality is to maybe embrace some of the discursive frameworks that were common to the people who were actually feeling those things at the time and translate from there in a temporal sort of way to where we've gotten to now, if that helps.
Thank you very much. This might be a two-pronged question. I'm not sure if the prongs are on the same board. One, I really appreciate your concern to find an approach on between the sciences and what we do in humanities and social sciences. Many of the arguments I know in the sciences are concerned with the origins of the emotions, from whence do they come. But it seems to me that humanistic discourse and religions are also concerned with the orientation of the emotions. If that's the case, in other words, if there cannot be a complete isomorphism because religious folks and so on are trying to go somewhere or do something with their emotions, in what way does religious studies help us rethink the very theories you're drawing on to explain religion?
Yeah, well, so I think that one of the things that religious studies can contribute is that the history of religion is rich with languages about really complex emotional experiences, many of which have been written out of the kind of scientific research that we do these days. There's an attempt to simplify and move it back to just the smallest number of things that can be funded for research, and to avoid those descriptions of other emotional states that might be a little bit more ambiguous and difficult to fit into the usual machinery of analysis that we're used to as people who do cultural history or even kind of social science of emotions. So what religion has to contribute to is this great reservoir of testimony about different kinds of experiences that sometimes don't fit so well in an early 20th century culture, which won't name an emotion like feeling of absolute dependence as a legitimate emotion, but which apparently some people in the early 19th century thought was a very legitimate emotion. So there's that possibility of an inroad, I think, paying attention to the traces of emotional life that are relevant in religious studies literature.
So it adds to the inventory, but it doesn't allow us to reconceive what the inventory is.
Yeah, that's a little bit harder. Yeah. I'm not sure we're really theoretically at the point where we begin to do that yet. You know, right now it has something to do with inventorying, but also inventorying in a way that brings to the forefront the variety of, and maybe the variety, but also the implication of one kind of emotional experience with another. That's what we need to do before we can move on to the kind of project we have on. Thanks. Yes, sure. Yes.
I'm a little hung up on the metaphor of the inventory. And I get that it dovetails with some of these ideas of feelings as things that are also commodities in some cases. But in real life inventories today, the object on the shelf sometimes has got an expense sunk into it. Sometimes it has expense yet waiting to be written down. Sometimes it's free of expense. There are all kinds of economic qualifications to the standing of whatever it is on the inventory shelf. And I'm wondering whether inventory is actually a better figure than, say, archive. And why not speak in terms of an archive of emotions or some other system of classification? Or is there something really so neutral about the inventory that it's really best meant?
I think archive could be useful. Archive seems the last few years to be such a loaded term, though, for scholars that it has all kinds of implications of how we actually make an analysis of fill-in-the-blank emotion in this case. Inventory, not so much. Inventory, I agree with you, does carry a certain amount of baggage having to do with the fact that it's a commodity in a kind of way, even as I originally picture it. But it's still, I think, a little bit simpler, maybe a little bit more neutral when it's talking about an archive. I think archive has become a politicized term over the last several years. Yes?
So as I think about what you're saying, and you have talked about mixing disciplines and that sort of thing, I was wondering how your work with spatial humanities might affect your understanding and even your conceptualization about emotion and how it all relates to one another, to each other, and to the players performing. I wonder if there's some meeting up.
Well, bodies have to be in space, right?
Right.
So I guess that's a good first step in thinking about it. But yeah, well, I mean, what you're talking about, this kind of idea that everything gets spatially located, and the network, and all the little nodes, and all of the actants that are busy within that network are important in the sense of spatial relations one to the other that matter. That's certainly a part of thinking about emotion as well, because you have to have the body identified as a node somewhere along the line in relationships to other things. But it's a big question. I hope I can fill it. Yeah.
John, I have more of a thought than a question that I invite your comments about. And it has to do with the section in the lecture where you're trying to put some distance between one set of theories and another on the idea of emotions as objects. And your argument was that there is this turn to embodiment that opens up or reopens up the idea of emotions as subjective, right? And thus first person. That emotions are not just things that happen that I feel, and thus have a certain kind of meaning and import to me. Now it seems to me that's a somewhat different move, at least what I just traced, than the embodiment. It's saying that emotions are tied to matters of identity, right? And I was struck that pathway wasn't one that you pursued. But it seems to be one that's especially inviting for those of us who study religion, because it invites us to think about how religious identity transforms, okay, or renegotiates, or as it were, reconstructs feelings. That feelings in religious contexts might take on a certain kind of hue or dimension or trajectory or orientation, right? That simply turning to matters of embodiment might not capture. And so it struck me this strikes me as a pathway in which thinking about the relationship between the disciplines and the role of studying religion could offer a rather fruitful pathway. And so that's the statement that I guess I invite you to.
Yeah, well, that's very helpful. Because one of the things I keep stumbling over as I try to puzzle all of this out is how can I talk about emotional experience as something that we ought to treat subjectively, but at the same time, something that we should pay attention to towards measurable, really objectifiable components that we pay attention to, for example, when we study the brain or we study nerves and that sort of thing. In both cases, we're kind of thinking about feeling in religion as a thing, but it's a different kind of thing. So one way of talking about it is to say us as subjects now have some kind of common experience with people who we're paying attention to from maybe 100 years ago, and there's an attempt to discover this kind of subjective link and all of that. At the same time, though, I think we're trying to come to this conclusion that the only way we're able to say that is because we can objectify the experience of emotion itself in a way that makes it possible for us to show that a measurement across time indicates the similarity of that bodily experience then as well as now. So, I mean, it's a way of rephrasing what you're saying, but what you're suggesting is maybe a point that
I think there's a real tension. I mean, I think the argument that, let's say I'm proposing, would say that those emotions at the end of the day are a black box. They're not accessible because they are radically first-person. And so thinking about commonalities is a very, very difficult thing. So you have representations of them by those who have them, right? But then you're back to the problem that I presume the car is trying to get past.
And it isn't just a matter for historians or for people in religious studies. People who study emotion, period. People in psychology departments who study emotion have the same problem all the time. But a really good recent book, this book by Lisa Barrett, is just going to be out next month or so, How Emotions Are Made. Again, tries to take up this whole issue of what really is an emotion. UC Press published a great book about 10 years ago. I think it was actually called What is an Emotion? I don't probably remember it, but complicated, thoughtful, erudite. You get to the end, it still kind of looks like a little bit like a black box. I used to go to meetings for years of the International Society for Research on Emotion, and there'd always be a number of sessions in which a big board would be in front of the room, and people who did AI especially very interested in this, but they'd explain how an emotion would come into being. And there'd be a circle with a stimuli, big S, with an arrow pointing to something in a box, if this, then that, and so forth. There'd be 100 boxes all over with arrows and dotted lines and so forth, trying to explain how it is that emotion happens. And I don't think I ever left one of those sessions with everybody scratching their head and wondering what in the world they're talking about. Not to say that we shouldn't study, but the point about the black box is one that no matter who it is doing what kind of emotion and what discipline always runs up against. It's, how we can figure out both sides of this. Yes.
I appreciated your sort of orienting this concept, or it's such an important intellectual exemplary, I guess, in its and it made me wonder by the end whether he would have been better or more, whether he would have said more or less in that essay if they had access to the kind of I have, and could have said, oh, here's the brain of somebody who's really upset about the brain of Moody, and here's the brain of somebody who's diverse society, they look the same, isn't that something? Given the prestige of sort of brain science and the confidence with which at the sort of level of discourse can be talked about manipulating emotions for political purposes, either to create an outcome or to delegitimate an outcome as having been driven by this sort of manipulated emotional response, as Hofstadter was trying to do it in a way. He was trying to delegitimize certain, he was commenting on ongoing politics in his age. What's the balance between the sort of power for truly gaining knowledge and the danger of reductionism? If we talk about public life through emotions as discerned by things like, brain imaging and brain chemistry, and that being sort of the key to understanding what emotions are and how they operate.
Yeah. I'm entirely sympathetic to your point. First of all, for me, it's no fun. Once we strip out all that other stuff that we do, who's got power and why they have it, and those things that are, I think, the undertone of what we're talking about, the stuff that cultural historians would care about, it isn't very exciting to me anymore. The trick is, again, trying to broach conversations between possibilities of doing that kind of cultural history, and at the same time taking seriously the brain scans that you're referring to. I think more and more what we're going to find is that the way we talk about emotion, the way we talk about the study of religion, is that you just can't separate it. You can't separate the brain scan. You can't separate the blood work from the immediate environment that somebody lives in as a person who practices a certain religion. I think it's all got to be somehow homeostatically added up or comprehensively added up to give a big picture of things. But I understand the point that you're making. It's a really difficult question. Would Hofstadter have thought differently about turning on if he had access to brain scans? In this case, I don't think so, because he had a different agenda of fish to fry about American political history. But we should think about that. I think there's a question here first.
This is just a suggestion. I don't know where to go with really, but it'd be interesting to take everything you looked at and see where the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius might fit in, the discernment of spirits. And the reason I say that, there's a lot of feeling and emotion. The reason I suggested there's a couple of, first of all, the role of the imagination plays would be interesting. But secondly, in light of what you were saying about the difference over time, history, Shakespeare, was not somebody else's. There's a kind of a linguistic basis for those exercises, and it goes back to the 16th century. And so the spiritual exercises that are given in various contexts over time, it's going to be interesting to track that in some way. The other thing I'm thinking about is that those exercises have been given in various cultures too, and it's kind of illuminating to see wanting to do to illuminate what you're talking about.
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot to be done with that, particularly if you want to zero in on physical exercises of various sorts. There's a body of research about 30 years old. Some of it's pretty good, some of it gets questioned a lot, that suggests that acting in a certain sort of way that you feel an emotion actually makes you feel that emotion. So if you walk around smiling, when they try to measure the markers in your system that biologically would reflect a certain kind of state of happiness.
So again, just add to what you said, since you mentioned physical exercise, it seems that these Ignatian spiritual exercise would find it particularly ripe for that kind of analysis because of the deep incarnational, someone like Bernard Lonergan, who's a Jesuit influenced by Ignatian spirit, we have no difficulty, I think, trying to integrate those various levels of the physical and psychological areas. I just think it'd be an interesting area.
Yeah, no, I think so too. Yeah, that's what I say. Religious studies is just so rich with all this kind of stuff that it's a great field in which to be working if you care about emotion, because there's so many different ways you can draw on this stuff to advance some further understanding of emotion. At the same time, maybe enhance our knowledge of what we know about religion. Yes, sorry. Were you going to say something?
Thank you for a fascinating lecture. I wonder if there's a relationship between the phenomenal experience of the emotion in itself as testimony of that emotion, as text, and as document, and particularly if there's any kind of danger in asserting a subject behind the text where we only have the existing text and no other context further back we go, and in particular that many texts that display data of that emotion are useful. From the medieval period, for instance, we might assume that text was composed for a very particular discursive reason, and that is not a direct conveyance of the emotion in itself in a phenomenal sense, and whether there's a danger in trying to construct an inventory of emotions, we're actually just falling prey to accepting particularly situated communication or discourse about what emotion is supposed to look like within that setting, within a certain set of boundaries as to what was considered an acceptable display of emotion.
I think it's very good to be wary about that. I don't think there's let me put it this way. I think that a lot of our conversation about emotions still relies upon these folk categories of emotion rather than something that's ever been put together from the ground up, drawing upon kind of data that maybe you and I would like to see go into it. When we talk about love, we're talking about something that has a cultural resonance beyond which we're able to measure. It's a different sort of way of talking about emotion than sometimes the science of emotion, the neuroscience of emotion talks about. It doesn't mean that it's wrong. I mean, there's value in folk categories. They embody some kind of cultural baggage. It's worthwhile. It's important even. But I totally agree with you. You have to be very wary about using these kind of terms or categories all the time for what you feel. Yes?
First of all, thank you very much for a very rich lecture here. I was wondering if you could talk a little more about the commerce of emotions and two examples, and how this complicates our picture if you have truly reformed emotions. And I imagine, I think that perhaps televangelists who are putting on a very specific performance at times in order to elicit particular emotions from their audience. And then now with social media, there's real actors in Chicago who are putting on performances of anger and that are eliciting a certain sort of reaction from white people in the suburbs buying these CDs. They also have the risks of retaliation that come from that. But these are performances, actually performances, trying to sell a type of emotional presentation. And then how does that complicate this, as we're talking about sort of here, almost disembodied emotion to our originally embodied emotion.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is what capitalism does, right? I mean, everything becomes a commodity, and everything, some way or another, becomes either something you want to pay money for or a means to acquire something. I think that the way to begin to puzzle all that out is to think about emotion in many cases as transactional. That emotion is part of exchanges that take place. In my view, emotional exchanges take place between individuals. They can take place between nature and people. They can take place between, a person and the deity that they worship. To think of emotion in a transactional way evokes those kinds of ideas that you're suggesting about how it's involved in advancing a certain agenda that someone might have, or gaining something, or persuading others to join your agenda, whatever it might be. There's transactional elements that's very important that wouldn't be possible, I think, unless at some level there was an inkling of emotion as being a commodity, as being something that has value that can be exchanged for something else. Yes.
To follow up on that, so the exchange would have happened with humans before so-called capitalism, however you define it, was sort of identified in practice. So are you saying capitalism would intensify it,
Yes.
make it known?
Yes.
The exchanges happened before.
That's correct. That's correct. That's a good clarification. I think it's just intensified. It's made more visible, and I think it's made more far-reaching in this particular environment that we're all alive in. But sure, it's very involved. Yeah.
One more thing. You might have thought I've been reaching in my analogy with Westbrook, which is like the MVP, we give a plaque out. So I want to read this and then I'll present it to John. For his myriad contributions as scholar, editor, digital humanist, and teacher, for his field-defining scholarship on emotion and religion, for his advancement of the values and traditions of the Chicago School from the 20th into the 21st century, the Baptist Theological Union names John Corrigan Alumnus of the Year 2017.